Memorable nonsense, or sound with a certain hypnotic power, is the really primitive and radical form of poetry. Nor is such poetry yet extinct. Children still love and compose it, and every genuine poet, on one side of his genius, reverts to it from explicit speech. As all language has acquired its meaning, and did not have it in the beginning, so the man who launches a new locution, the poet who creates a symbol, must do so without knowing what significance it may eventually acquire. Unconscious at best, only of the emotional background from which it emerged, pure poetry is pure experiment, and it is not strange that 9/10 of it should be pure failure. For it matters little what unutterable things may have originally gone together with a phrase in the dreamer's mind. If they were not uttered, and the phrase cannot call them back, this verbal relic is none the richer for the high company it may once have kept. Expressiveness is most accidental matter. What a line suggests at one reading, it may never suggest again, even to the same person. For this reason, among others, poets are partial to their own compositions. They truly discover there depths of meaning which exist for nobody else. Those readers who appreciate a poet and make him their own fall into a similar illusion. They attribute to him what they themselves supply, and whatever he reels out, lost in his own personal reverie, seems to them like sortes biblicae, written to fit their own case. Justice has never been done to Plato's remarkable consistency and boldness in declaring that poets are inspired by divine madness, and yet, when they transgress rational bounds, are to be banished from an ideal republic, though not without some marks of Platonic regard. Instead of fillets, a modern age might assign them a coterie of flattering dames, and instead of banishment, starvation. But the result would be the same in the end. A poet is inspired because what occurs in his brain is a true experiment in creation. His apprehension plays with words and their meanings, as nature, in any spontaneous variation, plays with her own structure. An automatic force shifts the kaleidoscope, a new direction is given to growth, or a new gist to signification. This inspiration, moreover, is mad, being wholly ignorant of its own issue, and without it has a confused fund of experience and verbal habit on which to draw. It draws on this fund blindly and quite at random, consciously possessed by nothing but a certain stress and pregnancy, and the pains, as it were, of parturition. Finally, the new birth has to be inspected critically by the public censor before it is allowed to live. Most probably, it is too feeble and defective to prosper in the common air, or it is a monster that violates some primary rule of civic existence, tormenting itself to disturb others. Plato seems to have exaggerated the havoc which these poetic dragons can work in the world. They are in fact more often absurd than venomous, and no special legislation is needed to abolish them. They soon die quietly of universal neglect. The poetry that ordinarily circulates among a people is poetry of a secondary and conventional sort, that propagates established ideas in trite metaphors. Popular poets are the parish poets of the muse, retailing her ancient divinations to a long since converted public. Plato's quarrel was not so much with poetic art as with ancient myth and emotional laxity. He was preaching a crusade against the established church. For naturalistic deities, he wished to substitute moral symbols for the joys of sense, austerity, and abstraction. To proscribe Homer was a marked way of protesting against the frivolous reigning ideals. Homer, indeed, was no primitive poet. He was a consummate master, the heir to generations of discipline in both life and art. This appears in his perfect prosody, in his limpid style, in his sense for proportion, his abstentions, and the frank pathos of his portraits and principles, in which there is nothing gross, subjective, or arbitrary. The inspirations that came to him never carried him into crudeness or absurdity. Every modern poet, Though the world he describes may be more refined in spots and more elaborate, it is less advanced in his art. For art is made rudimentary, not by its date, but by its irrationality. Yet even if Homer had been primitive, he might well have been inspired in the same way as Bacchic frenzy or mystic trance. The most blundering explosions may be justified antecedently by the plastic force that is vented in them. They may be expressive in the physical sense of this ambiguous word. As far as they may be from conveying an idea, they may betray a tendency and prove that something urgent is stirring in the soul. Expressiveness is often sterile, but it is sometimes fertile and capable of reproducing in representation the experience from which it sprang. As a tree in the autumn sheds leaves and seeds together, so ripening experience comes indifferently to various manifestations, some barren and without further function, others fit to carry the parent experience over into another mind and give it a new embodiment there. Expressiveness in the former case is dead, like that of a fossil. In the latter, it is living and efficacious, recreating its original. The first is idle self-manifestation, the second, rational art. Primitive poetry is the basis of all discourse. If we open any ancient book, we come at once upon an elaborate language, and on diverse conventional concepts, of whose origin and history we hear nothing. We must read on, until by dint of guessing and by confronting instances, we grow to understand these symbols. The writer was himself heir to a linguistic tradition which made his own by the same process of adoption and tentative use by which we, in turn, interpret his phrases. He understood what he heard in terms of his own experience and attributed to his predecessors, no matter what their incommunicable feelings may have been, such ideas as their words generated in his own thinking. In this way, expressions continually change their sense. They can communicate a thought only by diffusing a stimulus, and in passing from mouth to mouth, they will wholly transform their connotation, unless some external object or some recurring human situation lends them a constant standard by which private aberrations may be checked. Thus, in the first phrase of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The words have a stable meaning only in so far as they are indicative and bring us back to a stable object. What heavens and earth stand for can be conveyed by gestures, by merely pointing up and down, but beyond that sensuous connotation, their meaning has entirely changed since they were here written, and no two minds, even today, will respond to these familiar words with exactly the same images. Beginning and created have a superficial clearness, though their implications cannot be defined without precipitating the most intricate metaphysics, which would end in nothing but a proof that both terms are ambiguous. As the word God, all mutual understanding is impossible. It is a floating, literary symbol, with a value which, if we define it scientifically, becomes quite algebraic. As no experienced object corresponds to it, it is without fixed indicative force, and emits any sense which its context and any mind may happen to give it. In the first sentence of Genesis, its meaning, we may safely say, is a masculine being by whom heaven and earth were created. To fill out this implication, other instances of the word would have to be gathered, in each of which, of course, the word would appear with a new and perhaps incompatible meaning. Whenever a word appears in a radically new context, it has a radically new sense. The expression in which it so figures is a poetic figment, a fresh literary creation. Such invention is sometimes perverse, sometimes humorous, sometimes sublime. That is, it may either buffet old associations without enlarging them, or give them a plausible but impossible twist, or enlarge them to cover, with unexpected propriety, a much wider and more momentous experience. The force of perception in any moment, if we abstract it from represented values, is emotional, so that for sublime poetry, what is required is to tap some reservoir of feeling. If a phrase opens the floodgates of emotion, it has made itself most deeply significant. Its discursive range and clearness may not be remarkable, its emotional power will quite suffice. For this reason again, primitive poetry may be sublime. In its in-choate phrases, there is affinity to raw passion, and their very blindness may serve to bring that passion back. Poetry has body. It expresses the volume of experience as well as its form. And to express volume, the primitive poet will rely rather on rhythm, sound, and condensed suggestion than on discursive fullness or scope. The descent from poetry to prose is in one sense a progress. When use has worn down a poetic phrase to its external import and rendered it an indifferent symbol for a particular thing, that phrase has become prosaic. It has also become, by the same process, transparent and purely instrumental. In poetry, feeling is transferred by contagion. In prose, it is communicated by bending the attention upon determinate objects. The one stimulates, and the other informs. Under the influence of poetry, various minds radiate from a somewhat similar core of sensation, from the same vital mood, into the most diverse and incommunicable images. Interlocutors, speaking prose, on the contrary, pelt and besiege one another with a peripheral attack. They come into contact at sundry superficial points, and thence push their agreement inwards, until perhaps a practical coincidence is arrived at in their thought. Agreement is produced by controlling each mind externally, through a series of checks and little appeals to possible sensation. Whereas in poetry, the agreement, where it exists, is vague and massive. There is an initial fusion of minds under hypnotic musical influences, from which each listener, as he wakes, passes into his own thoughts and interpretations. In prose, the vehicle for communication is a conventional sign, standing in the last analysis for some demonstrable object or controlling feeling. Before this comes about, experience remains a constantly renovated dream, as poetry to the end conspires to keep it. For poetry, while truly poetical, never loses sight of initial feelings and underlying appeals. It is incorrigibly egotistic, and takes every present passion and every private dream in turn for the core of the universe. By creating new signs, or by recasting and crossing those which have become conventional, it keeps communication massive and instinctive, immersed in music, and inexhaustible by clear thought. Lying is a privilege of poets because they have not yet reached the level on which truth and error are discernible. Veracity and exactness are not ideals for a primitive mind. We learn to value them as we learn to live, and we discover that the spirit cannot be wholly free and solipsistic. To have to distinguish fact from fancy is so great a violence to the inner man that not only poets, but theologians and philosophers still protest against such a distinction. They urge what is perfectly true for a rudimentary creature, that facts are merely conceptions, and conceptions full-fledged facts. But this interesting embryonic lore they apply in their intellectual weakness to retracting or undermining those human categories which, though alone fruitful or applicable in life, are not congenial to their half-formed imagination. Retreating deeper into the inner chaos, they bring to bear the whole momentum of an irresponsible dialectic to frustrate the growth of representative ideas. In this they are genuine, if somewhat belated. Poets, experimenting anew with solved problems, and fancying how creation might have moved upon other lines. The great merit that prose shares with science is that it is responsible. Its conscience is a new and wiser imagination, by which creative thought is rendered cumulative and progressive. For man does not build less boldly or solidly if he takes the precaution of building in baked brick. Prose is in itself meager and bodiless, merely indicating the riches of the world. Its transparency helps us to look through it to the issue, and the signals it gives fill the mind with an honest assurance and prophetic art far surer than any ecstasy. as men of action have a better intelligence than poets, if only their action is on a broad enough stage, so the prosaic rendering of experience has the greater value, if only the experience rendered covers enough human interest. Youth and aspiration indulge in poetry. A mature and masterful mind will often despise it, and prefer to express itself laconically in prose. It is clearly proper that prosaic habits should supervene in this way on the poetical. For youth, being as yet little fed by experience, can find volume and depth only in the soul, and half seen the supermundane, the inexpressible, seem to it alone beautiful and worthy of homage. Time modifies the sentiment in two directions. It breeds lassitude and indifference towards impracticable ideals, originally no less worthy than the practicable. Ideals which cannot be realized, and are not fed at least by partial realizations, soon grow dormant, while things impossible thus lose their serious charm. Things actual reveal their natural order and variety. These not only can entertain the mind abstractly, but they can offer 1,000 material rewards in observation and action. In their presence, a private dream begins to look rather cheap and hysterical. Not that existence has any dignity or prerogative in the presence of will, but that will itself, being elastic, grows definite and firm when it is fed by success, and its formed and expressible ideals then put to shame the others which have remained vague for want of practical expression. Mature interests center on soluble problems and tasks capable of execution. It is at such points that the ideal can be really served. The individual's dream straightens and reassures itself by merging with the dream of humanity. To dwell, as the irrational poets do, on some private experience, on some emotion, without representative or ulterior value, then seems a waste of time. Fiction becomes less interesting than affairs, and poetry turns into a sort of incompetent whisper, a childish foreshortening of the outspread world. On the other hand, prose has a great defect, which is abstractness. It drops the volume of experience in finding bodiless, algebraic symbols by which to measure it. The verbal form, instead of transmitting an object, seems to constitute it, in so far as there is an object suggested at all, and the ulterior situation is described only in the sense that a change is induced in the hearer which prepares him to meet that situation. Prose seems to be a use of language in the service of material life. It would tend, in that case, to undermine its own presence, for in proportion as signals for action are quick and efficacious, they diminish their sensuous stimulus and fade from consciousness. Were language such a set of signals, it would be something merely instrumental, which if made perfect, ought to be automatic and unconscious. It would be a buzzing in the ears, not a music native to the mind. Such a theory of language would treat it as a necessary evil, and would look forward, hopefully, to the extinction of literature, in which it would recognize nothing ideal. There is, of course, no reason to deprecate the use of vocals or any other material agency to expedite affairs. But an art of speech, if it is to add any ultimate charm to life, has to supervene upon a mere code of signals. Prose, could it be purely representative, would be ideally superfluous. A literary prose accordingly owns a double allegiance, and its life is amphibious. It must convey intelligence, but intelligence clothed in a language that lends the message an intrinsic value. It makes it delightful to apprehend apart from its importance in ultimate theory or practice. Prose is in that measure a fine art. It might be called poetry that had become pervasively representative, and was altogether faithful to its rational function. We may therefore with good reason distinguish prosaic form from prosaic substance. A novel, a satire, a book of speculative philosophy may have a most prosaic exterior. Every phrase may convey its ideal economically, but the substance may nevertheless be poetical. since these ideas may be irrelevant to all ulterior events, and may express nothing but the imaginative energy that called them forth. On the other hand, a poetic vehicle in which there is much ornamental play of language and rhythm may clothe a dry ideal skeleton. So those tremendous positivists, the Hebrew prophets, and the most prosaic notions about the goods and evils of life. So Lucretius praised, I will not say the atoms merely, but even fecundity and wisdom. The motives, to take another example, which Racine attributed to his personages, were prosaically conceived. A physiologist could not be more exact in his calculations, for even love may be made the mainspring in a clockwork of emotions. Yet that Racine was a born poet appears in the music, nobility, and tenderness of his medium. He clothes his intelligible characters in magical and tragic robes. The aroma of sentiment rises like a sort of pungent incense between them and us, and no dramatist has ever had so sure a mastery over transports and tears. Is there not, we may ask, some ideal form of discourse in which apperceptive life could be engaged with all its volume and transmuting power, and in which at the same time no misrepresentation should be involved? Transmutation is not erroneous when it is intentional. Misrepresentation does not please for being false, but only because truth would be more congenial if it resembled such a fiction. Why should not discourse, then, have nothing but truth in its import and nothing but beauty in its form? With regard to euphony and grammatical structure, there is evidently nothing impossible in such an ideal, for these radical beauties of language are independent of the subject matter. They form the body of poetry. But the ideal and emotional atmosphere, which is its soul, depends on the things external to language, which no perfection in the medium can modify. It might seem as if the brilliant substitutions, the magic suggestions essential to poetry, would necessarily vanish in the full light of day. The life of reason involves sacrifice. What forces yearn for the ideal, being many and incompatible, have to yield and partly deny themselves in order to attain any ideal at all. There is something sad in all possible attainment, so long as there is limitation to put up with, and the memory of many a defeat. Rational poetry is possible, and would be infinitely more beautiful than the other, but the charm of unreason, if unreason seemed charming, it certainly could not preserve. And what human fancy demands, as at present constituted, there are irrational elements. The given world seems insufficient. Possible things have to be imagined, both to extend its limits and to fill in and vivify its texture. Homer has a mythology without which experience would have seemed to him undecipherable. Dante has his allegories and his mock science. Shakespeare has his romanticism, Goethe his symbolic characters and artificial machinery. All this lumber seems to have been somehow necessary to their genius. They could not reach expression in more honest terms. If such indirect expression could be discarded, it would not be missed. But while the mind, for want of a better vocabulary, is reduced to using these symbols, it pours into them a part of its own life and makes them beautiful. Their loss is a real blow, while the incapacity that called for them endures, and the soul seems to be crippled by losing its crutches. There are certain adaptations and abbreviations of reality, which thought can never outgrow. Thought is representative. It enriches each soul and each moment with substitutes for surrounding existences. If discourse is to be significant, it must transfer to its territory and reduce to its scale whatever objects it deals with. In other words, thought has a point of view and cannot see the world except in perspective. This point of view is not, for reason, locally or naturally determined. Sense alone is limited in that material fashion, being seated in the body and looking thence centrifugally upon things, in so far as they come into dynamic relations with that body. Intelligence, on the contrary, sallies from that physical stronghold and consists precisely in shifting and universalizing the point of view, neutralizing all local, temporal, or personal conditions. Yet intelligence, notwithstanding, has its own center and point of origin, not explicitly in space or in a natural body, but in some specific interest or moral aim. It translates animal life into moral endeavor. What figured in the first as a local existence figures in the second as a specific good. Reason, accordingly, has its essential bias, and looks at things as they affect the particular form of life which reason expresses. And though all reality should be ultimately swept by the eye of reason, the whole would still be surveyed by a particular method, from a particular starting point, for a particular end. Nor would it take much shrewdness to perceive that this nucleus for discourse and estimation, this ideal life, corresponds in the moral world to that animal body which gave sensuous experience its seat and center, so that rationality is nothing but the ideal function or aspect of natural life. Reason is universal in its outlook and in its sympathies. It is the faculty of changing places ideally and representing alien points of view. But this very self-transcendence manifests a certain special method in life, an equilibrium which a far-sighted being is able to establish between itself and its comprehended conditions. Reason remains to the end essentially human, and, in its momentary actuality, necessarily personal. We have here an essential condition of discourse, which renders it, at bottom, poetical. Selection and applicability govern all thinking, and govern it in the interest of the soul. We should not wish to know things in themselves, even if we are able. What it concerns us to know about them is merely the service or injury they are able to do us, and in what fashion they can affect our lives. To know this would be, in so far, truly to know them. But it would be to know them through our own faculties, and through their supposed effects. It would be to know them by their appearance. A single proof of the frivolous way in which philosophers often proceed when they think they are particularly profound is seen in this puzzle. How is it possible to know reality if all we attain and experience is but appearance? The meaning of knowledge, which is an intellectual and living thing, is here forgotten, and the notion of sensation or bodily possession is substituted for it. So what we are really asked to consider is how, had we no understanding, we should be able to understand what we endure. It is by conceiving what we endure to be the appearance of something beyond us, that we reach knowledge that something exists beyond us, and that it plays in respect to us a determinate role. There could be no knowledge of reality if what conveyed that knowledge were not felt to be appearance, nor can a medium of knowledge better than appearance be by any possibility conceived. To produce such appearances is what makes realities knowable. Knowledge transcends sensation by rising to a supersensuous plane, the plane of principles and causes. These principles and causes are what we call the intelligible, or the real world, and the sensations, when they have been so interpreted and underpinned, are what we call appearance. If a poet could clarify the myths he begins with, so as to reach ultimate scientific notions of nature and life, he would still be animated by vivid feeling and its imaginative expression. Tragic, fatal, intractable, he might well feel that the truth was, but these qualities have never been absent from the half-mythical world through which poets, for want of a rational education, have hitherto wandered. A rational poet's vision would have the same moral functions which myth was asked to fulfill, and fulfilled so treacherously. Such a poet would doubtless need a robust genius, if he possessed it, and in transmuting all existence, falsified nothing, giving that picture of everything which human experience in the end would have drawn, he would achieve an ideal result. In prompting mankind to imagine, he would be helping them to live. His poetry, without ceasing to be a fiction in its method and ideality, would be an ultimate truth in its practical scope. It would present, in graphic images, the total efficacy of surrounding things. Such a poetry would be more deeply rooted in human nature than in any casual fancy, and therefore more appealing to the heart. The images they have worked out would confront human passion more intelligibly than does the world as at present conceived, with its mechanism half ignored and its ideality half invented. They would represent vividly the uses of nature, and thereby make all natural situations seem so many incentives to art.